All right, everyone. Today we have another amazing guest here at Mold Talks. All of our guests are amazing, but honestly, I always get excited to talk to new people. Today we have Rain. Rain, go ahead and introduce yourself. Let everyone know why you're here. And we're so thankful that you are here today.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I'm so excited. So my name is Rain Holton. I live in Michigan, and I am currently an integrative health practitioner student and a licensed esthetician. I first got sick from mold when I started my business in a salon. So I'm here to spread the word and let everybody know not to live in mold, not to work in mold, to get away from it.
Well, thank you for doing that. And, it's always amazing when someone can kind of take this really crappy tragedy and empower others through what they've been through. So thank you for that. It's my understanding you haven't felt well your whole life. Let's dive into that. Why is that? Why do you think that is? Did you experience mold, do you think, as a child? And, walk us through what you meant by that.
Yeah. So most of the thing I've used for healing has been Dr. Jess Petros's Wellness Plus. So there's a lot of information on there. And I think all of us learning about mold and discovering mold is the issue. Is some of it is like researching, learning on our own, or learning from other people that have had the same experience, because there's no way to tell, quote unquote, that mold is your issue unless you specifically run like a mycotoxins test. Like the Western medicine doctor is not going to come, you're not going to go to them and they're going to be like, mold is your issue, we know it. So
unfortunately, that needs to change, by the way, but yes, unfortunately, that's true.
Right. So I would say, after learning what I've learned and tracing back, the problem with mold is that it never runs alone. It always has all these like frenemies, Lyme, candida, parasites, everything. So looking back, I believe I may have been born with Lyme, which tells me that my mother probably had Lyme and mold issues too, and maybe didn't know. So I would say one of my first memories is having a scalp rash, which is from mold. And it's like irritating, so you itch it. So I think I've always been sensitive, and growing up, I lived in apartments, which I don't think is really the best place for people to live if you have sensitivities, because, it's not just coming from your unit. Could be coming from any place in the building and getting through the vents. Is my understanding. So, I think I always had some of the mold symptoms, and then maybe moved and they lightened up. But as soon as I started actually working in a moldy basement and then also having a mold leak in my house, it really just made everything just run rampant.
Yes, let's talk about that. You started a business in a basement in 2018, which made you super sick, and you stayed in that basement until March of 2022. March of 2020. So about 2 years. How did you come to realize that it was the basement that was making you sick?
Yeah, so I actually didn't realize it until I left. So I had started seeing a naturopath virtually in Idaho. And I was just like, I have all these health issues. I have a lot of fatigue. That was, I think, my biggest problem, because when you have fatigue, you can't do anything. So she started running tests, and she was like, oh, after we got my first labs back, which was blood, spit, and a gut test, she was like, since you've been doing the supplements I recommended from those tests and you're not feeling 100%, she's like, I think you should take a mold test. And I'm like, I don't have mold. No, it's fine. I don't have that. I don't need to take that. So I waited and waited until my next visit with her. And she's like, you never called to take the mold test. And I'm like, I don't have mold. That's not my problem. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And then she was like, you have to take a mold test. And I was like, okay, I'll take it. And I test positive for 3 different types of mold. And she was like asking questions, kind of like discovering like, where could you have been exposed? And I'm like, well, like once you're like telling me about this and I read about it, I did work in a basement, and basements are really common to have mold.
You started to connect the dots at that point, essentially.
Yeah, I just started to connect the dots, and then, you learn more and more. And then I'm like, I don't feel right. I can't breathe very well when I'm at home. So then we found out that we had just a leak in our house, just a very, very, very small leak. Just when the water from the bathtub would just kind of splash off the side, it would go down into the kitchen. And I mean, that was probably going on for maybe 6 years.
Which is enough to have some of the more dangerous molds like Atomium or Stachybotrys present because you have this long-standing leak. And it was also my understanding that you found mold in your car at that point as well. So you had this basement, you had some mold in your home, some mold in your car. How did you find the mold in your car?
Yeah, so basically every step that I would take to get out of a moldy place, unfortunately, we'd find it somewhere else because I'm still getting these symptoms. So my fiance owns a car detailing business and we were going on vacation and he was like, "Well, we're bringing your car. I'm going to clean it up because you got lots of dog hair." And I'm like, "Yeah, so much dog hair, right?" So then he's like, "There was mold under your seat." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "That's probably part of your problem." I was like, "What?" So I think he fixed it. I don't really know how, but there was consistent like water getting underneath the driver's seat from something.
Wow. And so, yeah, it could have been humidity, could have been water, and maybe anytime it rained, you kind of it just water finds the path of least resistance. Who knows how that traveled? You also, I guess, did your workplace ever locate the mold? Was there any sort of musty smell? And how did you deal with that at the workplace?
Yeah, so I didn't find out about that place until I left.
Okay.
We kind of put it together and it was in a salon, so I did go back to one of my coworkers at that building and get a massage from her. But I as soon as I'm in there for like 10 minutes, I can start to get symptoms. But
Wow.
I never brought it to them. It was such an old building. It was an old house that they turned into commercial property
Okay.
and added on. And I think that the mold there was probably a case where it's in the walls.
Got
So
it.
I never brought it to their attention. That is still a standing business. And I would still say there's probably still mold.
Wow. Did you ever smell it? Like, did you notice like a musty smell or anything?
In the area that I worked, yes, but
Okay.
I never,
You didn't
when
put two
you're,
and two together, I guess, at that point?
and when you're there 24/7, you don't notice. I always
Yeah.
like burned candles or had essential oils on because I have clients coming in. So it's always good to walk into a business and it smell nice too.
Right.
So yeah,
You kind of mask that smell without realizing exactly what it is at that time.
yeah.
And so, so you mentioned Lyme.
Hmm.
I guess, do you know what came first? Like, did you have mold toxicity and then Lyme, or Lyme and then mold toxicity? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Lyme, I feel like I still am not fully understanding the whole concept of Lyme. I feel like it's very misunderstood. And from what I have heard, is that it can get activated. So, you know, you could get bit by a tick and you may not react the same way I would. I don't ever remember getting bit.
Okay.
Um, but I was born with a rash on my body and the doctors never knew what it was. They thought in 1995 that it was AIDS, which obviously it's not. So that's where I think that it was born with Lyme, maybe mold. I don't know.
Okay.
And I think the mold may have activated the Lyme and then just things started piling on when I started working in that basement.
Yeah, and too, like, mold and Lyme are so similar that sometimes you get misdiagnosed for one or the other. And when, I've seen people that have gotten out of mold and then miraculously, like, their Lyme has subsided. So, it's curious to see how that goes as time goes on. But what were, some of your symptoms? You told me kind of offline, and I wrote them all down here, but I would love for you to repeat those so that other people who may be experiencing similar issues can kind of get a sense of, wow, this sounds like me.
Yeah, totally. So I actually have them written down because I was like, there's a lot. And I will say a disclaimer to anybody, some of these symptoms can overlap with other things, but this was a lot of the stuff I was experiencing while actively in mold.
Okay.
Um, so I can always tell when I'm exposed if I start sneezing. I usually do not sneeze unless there's mold around. My head rash, which is like little patches of dry spots, and then my scalp would start to burn. I eventually developed a gluten sensitivity. I had super dark circles around my eyes and like dark patches on my skin. A lot of digestive issues. I would get really puffy, so much brain fog. That is definitely one of the most debilitating symptoms. For a while when I first started working in that salon, I could not remember what day it was. Sometimes I couldn't even remember the client's name that was walking up for their appointment. It was pretty bad. Chronic pain, chronic joint pain, a lot of my hair fell out. And then I had a lot of the like mental quote unquote symptoms. Like I had a lot of anger that I didn't understand because that wasn't who I am. Depression, anxiety, sinus issues, watery eyes, fatigue. One of the things I definitely struggled with was electrolyte imbalance or like constant thirst. I drank so much water, constantly urinate, and then was still thirsty no matter how much I drank. Like sleep problems, some skin rashes. I've never been diagnosed, but I assume that some of the symptoms I experience are probably some SIRS because I definitely get a lot of inflammation. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't read a book the entire time I was working there, and that was something I actually loved to do for maybe until a couple months I was on supplements for a mold protocol. Vision changes, my vision would get blurry, it would kind of dilate while I'm like down there working. Stiffness, I eventually fainted. Body temperature regulation, and like the urinating problem that everyone has, like you just constantly have to go.
Yeah, and that is a lot of symptoms to have, right? To be dealing with on a consistent basis. Like this isn't just like I've got a headache, right? This is, I mean, there's a multitude of things happening that are literally debilitating your health. What does that do to you, to you mentally, right? I mean, having so many things that you're dealing with at one time, that's got to be hard, right? To
Right.
like, how do you cope with that, like loss of hope, when you're dealing with all these things?
The thing is it's crazy because, this laundry list of stuff was happening, even me fainting. It didn't phase me at the time until I start to realize, and I'm just like, I don't know what's wrong with me. My fiance is like, you're not the same person. Like, what's going on? And I'm like, I don't know. um, so I don't know if I really coped or like noticed what was going on. I would just a lot of the times go to work, come home, go to sleep. I didn't enjoy my life, didn't go out. If I wasn't working there, I would just lay on the couch.
And is that something that you would necessarily associate your personality with? Because I distinctly remember you telling me how you didn't feel like yourself, right? Like you were normally this chipper person, and you started to maybe it's something that happens such a slow like change that you don't necessarily realize unless you look back at a distant period of time. What was that like for you?
Yeah, it was definitely it's so hard when you're in it because you don't notice, but I definitely didn't feel like myself, and I blamed a lot of it on starting a business. Um and like learning to start a business, but it was even looking back and like even now, I say for the most part from mold, I'm pretty recovered, but I'm still not the same person I was before because it just takes so long to get rid of it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, sometimes we don't need to go back to who we were before, right? I mean, there's changes that happen in our life that empower us to be different in a better way, and not necessarily that you need to be this person that you were way back when. But I find it really interesting, kind of how these struggles in life can really change us. And a lot of the people around us may not totally understand, right, what we're going through. How was that like for you? Did you have, people that didn't understand what you were going through? Were there some challenges there, friends, family, etc.?
Yeah, I would definitely say that people didn't really understand, and I think people still don't understand unless they deal with it themselves because sometimes it's hard to describe. Like, you know, it's hard for me even now if I have joint pain or back then to describe the joint pain. It's just like I don't even know how to explain it to you. It just, sometimes it feels like my body is not mine anymore. You know, all these symptoms taking over, and you just can't be who you want to be. And I know I had a lot of doctors be like, you know, you're just depressed. And I was on pain medication and antidepressants at one point. Family is like, you know, it's all in your head. That's what people definitely like to say. And my fiance was always supportive. He definitely, I mean, he didn't know that it was mold then, but he believed me when I said, you know, I don't feel right. I don't know what's going on. But I think I like lied to myself and said it's because I'm starting a business. I'm just overworking myself.
What's your fiance's name?
Chase.
Chase, if you're listening to this, thank you for being such a great guy, such a supportive guy. You know, we need more of we need more supportive men out there. I deal with this all of the time. I would say a lot of the people that come to me dealing with this are women. And you hear so many sad stories about like the husband doesn't understand, the boyfriend doesn't understand, the fiance doesn't understand. And you know, look, there's many things that we don't understand. And one thing that we do have to understand though is to support one another, especially someone that you're supposed to love, right? And I think that society has had such a disconnect on this because, you know, it's just something that's never talked about. Like you don't go to your doctor and your doctor's like, "Hey, look, have you checked your air quality?" You know, because that may be it. Like when does that ever happen? Almost never. You know, yeah, obviously some doctors that know about mold, specifically in practice dealing with mold, sure. But most of the people that you go to see out there in the world are like, are you drinking enough water? You know, what are you eating? What sort of medication are you taking, right? That could be messing up your thought process here. But it's the reality of the situation is society is not looking at air quality. And it needs to, because environmental toxins and environmental exposures are such a real thing. And they can't take that away from you or I, right?
Right.
And that's what we're here to discuss. So Chase, thank you for supporting Rain here, and anyone who's listening, you know, really take that into consideration that, you know, there are problems that we deal with that don't make sense, and just because they don't make sense doesn't mean that the person doesn't need support. And I'm sure you really appreciate Chase and everything he's done, and you know, some of these doctors, which we're going to get into, you know, who should have supported you, who should have not said things like, you know, maybe you're just dealing with an anxiety and depression. Because by the way, when you're not feeling well and you're not sure why, you're going to deal with the anxiety and depression. So we're human beings here.
Right.
Let's talk about this. You've been to doctors the last 10 years. You
Mhm.
experienced things like UTIs. You were misdiagnosed beyond belief. You were dealing with treatments that weren't addressing root causes, et cetera, et cetera. You got introduced to a naturopathic doctor, brought you to Dr. Jess Pietros. You signed up for Wellness Plus. Awesome. So we have that really cool journey. But let's talk about let's go through that. Let's talk about what you experienced when you went to these doctors, sort of that gaslighting effect that we hear so much about. And then, you know, what it took to actually find someone who knew what they were doing. And, you know, would love to hear about how things are going with Dr. Jess Pietros, who, by the way, I personally have a high affinity for. I think she's awesome. So, you know, go ahead and explain that, please.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with like, okay. So a little bit before I started my business, maybe like 6 months before, I believe I started experiencing some Lyme symptoms slightly. The only thing I had was a stiff neck. So I went to the doctor and, you know, they ran tests and stuff. I did x-rays and they decided that it was my posture and that I need to go to physical therapy. Then they put me on, I believe it was 600 milligrams of naproxen a day. So I was taking 600 milligrams at night and 600 milligrams at night, or in the morning and at night, of prescription Aleve. So that didn't help. The physical therapy didn't help very much. And then I started doing yoga, which helped a lot, probably because it helped me de-stress. And, you know, they kept saying, you know, it's your posture, you need more pain medication. And then my doctor, I went to her and she put me on, what was it? I think the first one was Zoloft. And I didn't have a good experience with it. I think I maybe didn't even finish the prescription, and it made me more depressed, and I drank heavier, and I also gained about 25 pounds, and I didn't even finish 1 month prescription. So then I was like, I don't think this is right for me. I've been told, if one medication doesn't work for you, you might have to try it multiple just to see what one works with your body. So then she gave me something called Effexor. I took 1 dose of that once, and it made me so confused. I literally sweat buckets. I never took it again. So I went back to her, and I was like, I'm still not feeling well. And it was like some of the mold symptoms, because I did have mold in my house at this time. And she was like, I don't know how to help you at this point. You're gonna have to go see a psychologist, because that's who's gonna help you. And I'm like, I've only tried 2, and I have barely even taken maybe 25 pills total.
So is this like a primary care physician that was getting into the field of the mind by kind of?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it was like the doctor who you go to for like your physicals and anything, like if you're sick. And I was like,
I didn't know doctors were giving out anxiety medication these days. I thought that was like more of a crazy.
Yeah, so they have these forms you fill out like while you're waiting every single time, and it was like, how are you depressed? Are you happy with your life? And at that time I wasn't. I was like, I'm in pain. I don't know.
That's why I'm here, doc. I'm not feeling well.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, I start working in the moldy basement, and it gets worse, and I go back to the doctor who sent me to physical therapy, and I'm like, it's not getting better. And they're like, well, are you still taking the naproxen? And I'm like, well, kind of, but I'm kind of cutting it in half because this is a lot. So then he's like, well, at this point, we're going to have to give you cortisone shots in your neck. And I'm like, what? At the time, I was 23 years old. I was like, cortisone shots in my neck? I was like, I feel like that's really extreme. I was like, this is where I'm done. This is where I'm not listening to this anymore. So, a friend of mine made a health course for the profession I'm in, which is a lash artist. And her course was a little bit more holistic, and she introduced me to a holistic doctor. So then I saw her virtually, and she ran all the tests. She figured out that mold was the root cause of my problems, which was really nice for someone to actually like validate. Like, she's like, you've been so sick for so long. I'm so sorry. We can get you better. And I'm like, this is the first time someone has ever validated, because there was other doctors before, the one that prescribed the antidepressants and the one who prescribed physical therapy, but nothing, they never did anything extreme like this until I had more pain. So then she was the first person to validate everything. And I'm like, well, maybe that is the problem. And I'm open to holistic stuff because I never knew about it. And then all the stuff that doctor gave me, it worked for a while, but I realized that my drainage pathways weren't open, and she didn't really have, as far as I understand, a specific order in how she addressed stuff. So if your drainage pathways aren't open, when you're taking these supplements and you're trying to detox mold or anything, Lyme, anything, you're going to have problems, and it's going to get backed up, and it might make stuff worse. So on Instagram, one day I found Dr. Jess through a hashtag, or I don't even remember. And I started following her, and I was like, this stuff is really interesting, but everything she's saying makes sense, even though I'm not really accustomed to this kind of stuff. And I read like a post about like toothpaste, and I was like, maybe I'll try natural toothpaste. And then it just kind of spiraled. And then when she came out with Wellness Plus, I'm like, I feel like I could figure out like all my issues myself, because that's kind of how some holistic stuff is. Like, technically, you don't really need a lab to tell you. You can just try some of this stuff and kind of see what happens. So I started researching more and more and following her protocol. I wasn't fully getting better, and there's forms where you can talk to her and talk to a couple other doctors that she has on there or other members. And I was like, this is happening. I'm taking aggressive doses of the Cellcore or Microbe. They're both the same company. So Microbe formulas are Cellcore products. I'm taking the extreme doses, and I still don't feel like I'm getting better. And she's like, there's still mold in your home. You're missing something. You have a tooth infection, which they can grow mold, or you have mold in your home. So I went and seen a dentist. The dentist opened up my wisdom teeth spots and she's like, there's no infection. It's not in there. So I was like, well, Dr. Jess said to look at mold in the home, and we thought we had fixed the leak, and there was still, it had restarted, and there was still mold getting thrown out. So we fixed that again. And then now the protocol has been working for me better now that there's no active exposure.
And so that just going back to your house for a second, because I got some notes here. You remediated your house a total of 3 times, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about how important it is to hire someone who really knows what they're doing, so that you can do it in 1 time instead of 3 times. Like
Right.
How much financially that probably would have been better, and because I know like we have this stigma in the space here where like everybody who, you know, has plastic and suits as a remediator, and you know that a lot of people, and the question that I get asked all the time is like, what separates your methods from everybody else's? And I said it's very simple. We're actually looking at getting rid of the organism and the particulate created by the organism scientifically, whereas most companies are looking to get rid of things cosmetically. And so I would imagine the first couple companies you hired to fix it, or even if you did it yourself, like you were doing it on a cosmetic basis, like, okay, it looks like it's gone. That's great. But then you found out that it wasn't, right? So walk us through that. I'm sure you'll kind of see how I tie it together, but just based upon like doing it the right way and how much time, money, and aggravation that saves to do it that way.
Yeah, so we kind of did it ourselves because Chase is a let me do it. You know, he's very intelligent, so he's like, I can do it. But also, he's like, there's no mold, it's mildew. And I'm like, the same thing.
Yeah.
And he's like, there's no mold. I'm like, there's no black mold growing anywhere in our house where there's fuzzy things on the ceiling, right? I'm like, but there's mold somewhere. Like, you might not even see it.
Sure.
So what did he do originally? So it's so hard to describe. So just some of the water from the side of the shower was leaking down into where there is caulking and getting in between the caulking down into the kitchen. So he just recaulked it once, just on one
Okay.
side. And he's like, it's done.
It's fixed.
But
Yeah.
right. You know, we didn't really know anything about it at the time, but I did walk in from work after he did it, and I took a deep breath, and I could actually breathe in our house. So the good thing is we cut the moisture off from the mold, so it wasn't actively throwing out spores at the time that I came home. And then yeah, I'm like, which came first? So then I think I was in the kitchen, and our cat likes to lay in front of the sink, and I was petting the cat, and I feel a water droplet on my head. Maybe a couple weeks later, maybe like 3-4 weeks later, and I looked up and I was like, crap, no, what is going on? So I was like, oh man, he's not gonna be thrilled about we gotta fix it again. So I waited for him to come home, and I was like, so it's leaking again. And he's like, what do you mean it's leaking again? And I was like, I don't know, it's leaking again. So he's like, crap, I missed a spot. He recaulked it, and then I felt better for a while. And then I don't know if the caulking wore down or what happened. It just wasn't fixed fully. So then the last time I was like, okay, we got to get all of it. I was like, I heard that you can see mold with a black light. So I got a black light, and we shined it on the ceiling. And I was like, look, there's extra spots where we got to, fix it. So he ended up cutting out the flooring in the bathroom and all the boards, replacing them, completely sealing off so no water can get in it. And then he also did the kitchen, cut out all that part of the ceiling, sealed everything off.
Well, Chase, there's 50,000 companies out there that would have made the same mistake you did the first 2 times. So don't worry. But I'm glad you guys got that resolved properly. And yes, you have to cut it out, unfortunately, because it starts to grow into the building materials. And that's the difference between like doing things thoroughly and like actually removing it and then cleaning up the byproducts created through the existence of mold. So I'm glad you guys were able to resolve that. So we talked about kind of a lot of this stuff up to this point of kind of diagnosing that mold was a problem, getting through and figuring that out, remediating. You guys DIY'd it. You kind of figured out who to contact in terms of doctors. You went from one doctor to Dr. Jess Pietras. Um, I guess you've been kind of in this, what you and your fiance have been together 7.5 years. How long were you in this place that also was leaking?
So he bought this house about 9 years ago. So
Okay.
that was before we were together. And then I moved in, and I believe that leak had been slowly starting, but I think it got bigger because before I lived here was a bunch of men, roommates and him taking showers. Well, I would take baths, and I think that's when the water was splashing,
Yeah.
in that spot and leaking down. So I wouldn't be surprised if maybe it was here the whole time and maybe didn't affect me until maybe a year in. But looking back, ever since I lived here, I definitely had like the anger spurts or the depression and anxiety that I don't know if I actually experienced as much before living here.
Sure. Yeah, and like I think for most people, like it happens, it's just such a slow change that like, you don't necessarily realize. I mean, everyone's different, right? Some people like at the immediate onset, they know, but for most people, it can just be this slow process. What was the worst day that you had? We
Oh,
talked about this, about this day in particular, but would love for other people to, um, really know how scary this can be, right? Why don't you walk people through what the worst day was like for you?
yeah. So this is such a good question. I love this question, and it's so hard. You know, um, I would definitely say the day that I fainted was the worst. And looking back, I believe that's the same day that I dropped one of my tools on one of my clients. Granted, it didn't hurt them, but it definitely could have. And I thought it did. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I just dropped my tweezers on your forehead and it kind of punctured. But she's like, what are you talking about? I don't feel anything. I'm like, saved by the grace of the universe of God. Thank goodness. But that was the same day that I fainted. So I was waiting for my next client. I walk up the stairs and I just fall. And everyone's like, what happened? I'm like, where am I? They're like, you just fell. And I'm like, huh? What are you talking about? Why did I just fall?
And luckily you fell up the stairs and not down the stairs, right?
Yeah, I kind of just fell at the top forward. So thank goodness.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I said, it's for everybody. I mean, some people, their darkest day is more of the challenges they're experiencing mentally.
Right.
Sometimes the darkest day is what you're experiencing physically. And, thank God you didn't get hurt, right, from fainting and all of that. But this is some scary stuff, right? We want to make sure that, you know, the whole point of this podcast is for people to see this, a couple different purposes, right? But one, for people to know they're not alone, to see this and have, similar experiences. They know they're not alone. For two, the people that have never gone through anything like this, but maybe have family members that have, and they can see like how real this is. This is not made up, right? This is a real thing that people experience. There are, I believe, we're approaching our 50th podcast here today, which is like really exciting because these are 50 extraordinary stories with extraordinary human beings and the challenges that they've been through. And you know what? The other thing is like, it doesn't have to be this hard. If we
Right.
support one another, if we start changing our viewpoints, if doctors start becoming more educated on this topic, that environmentally we can become sick. If we look at all of these pieces of the puzzle together and put this in place, it doesn't have to be this hard. And so I appreciate you and everything you've been through to get to this point. And, thank you because you're paving the way for others. And, it wasn't easy. And I know it's still probably not easy, but it's so appreciative and so necessary that you like have figured this out. You're here, you're sharing your story. You're going to help other people in the process. So thank you for that, for being vulnerable here today and sharing your story. Would love to hear some recommendations you may have for others who may be going through similar challenges on, what you recommended for them.
Yeah. Also, thank you for doing the podcast. This is amazing that you're out here spreading the word too. That matters just as much as us telling our story.
Thank you for
Um,
that.
so my recommendations would be is make sure that you always listen to your body and don't let one person, don't let 50 people, don't let your husband, don't let your mother, don't let a stranger tell you that it's not real, because it is, especially if you're feeling it. But I would say you definitely have to find a protocol that works for you, because everyone's different. Everyone's going to respond different. There's no blanket approach. I would definitely say getting out of the exposure is super important, but unfortunately, some of this stuff can be such a financial burden that's not always possible. And I would definitely start, no matter where you are, is opening drainage pathways. So that's getting your body back to homeostasis and getting your organs functioning how they're supposed to again, because mold can really go after some of them. I know mold really went after my liver. I couldn't handle alcohol well, I couldn't handle caffeine well, definitely not fasting. So once your drainage pathways are open, definitely binders. That's the most important thing. I see or hear a lot of practitioners, naturopaths, anyone putting people on a mold protocol without binders, which is just kind of like, it kind of blows my mind, because you have to like you have to bind to the mold spores to get them out, because the whole reason you're sick is that because you can't dump the spores properly.
Right.
Um and then also, I think one of the things that's also overlooked is looking at food. Mold is really common in coffee. I mean, I'd be pretty interested to see how Starbucks coffee would be tested for mold.
I'm pretty sure Dave Asprey already did that for us. We know that it's not the best situation.
Oh,
So
he did? Okay.
for those that don't know, Dave Asprey was the founder of Bulletproof, which is a coffee company, and it was basically like, the $6 Starbucks coffee you drink is full of mold. Buy my coffee, Bulletproof coffee. There's another company called Purity that makes, and basically what it is they just test their coffee for mycotoxins, which the FDA is supposed to do as well. But I think that we need to rely on businesses to do a better job, not just on government regulations, but just on businesses to want to do a better job. I mean, that's how my company came born. It was just like we saw problems in the industry, and we just wanted to provide people with a better product that actually could make them healthy, instead of just like fixing things cosmetically, right? So we need coffee companies to step up and want to create, the capability to test to make sure that their coffee is safe, to test their coffee. But there's other things like peanuts, right? That have a lot of mold. So you make a very valid point. Like, you also want to, there's a diet that has to come to this. From what I understand, and maybe you going through Dr. Jess's program, you can kind of share how this works. But the idea is like, once you have this healthy environment, once you kind of detox, you eventually will be able to eat a peanut again. Is that right? Like, you are going to desensitize yourself. So
Yeah, and I would say it's hard to go through all of this, a detox, moving or fixing your home, and then having to change your diet on top of it. So, if you love peanut butter so much and you still want to detox from mold, I'm sure you having some peanut butter totally is not going to hurt you. Maybe you have to cut it out for a little bit, but there's other, like coffee, peanut butter, processed meats is really common, because I might be saying it wrong, but is it ochratoxin A? I
yes.
think that's the common one found in food. A lot of animals that are factory farmed, a lot of their food is contaminated with that. So then if they eat it, then their meat's contaminated with that,
Yeah.
and their dairy. Cacao is another one. So I always get this one brand. I think it's Addictive Wellness. They have a cacao powder, cacao nibs, that are mycotoxin tested. So yeah, I think there's some foods that are
There's even
uncommonly
wines,
difficult.
right? There's even wines for those who like to drink. There's even wines that now that test there's sources for mycotoxin free grapes and wines that are being, because that's another difficult thing. I mean, usually these wine cellars and in other countries are, underground or kept in these moldy environments with these moldy barrels that they're stored in, right? And it just creates this
Yeah,
whole problem. So, there is a way to be mindful, but you have to do a little research.
right. And just because you might react to coffee that's moldy, you might not react to some peanuts that could contain some mold too.
Trial and error, right? You gotta see what works best for you, and what works best for you might not work best for somebody else. That's why it's such an individual process. When I'm consulting with people, I'm letting them know, like, look, that person may be able to keep this, you may not, and it really depends. And the only way to do is to see for yourself how it's going to impact you. Rain, thank you so much for being here today, sharing your story. Any other last parting words?
No, I think just really listen to your body, pay attention, if you feel like there might be mold in an area. Also, side note, check your plants. If you're sensitive to mold, I may encourage you to possibly get rid of your house plants. I was also exposed by that. That one was the absolute worst. So if you feel like you may be experiencing symptoms somewhere, just listen to that. You never know what you could find. It could be a small, tiny plant sitting on your table.
Yeah, I did a whole post on plants recently, and yeah, I mean, there could be hundreds of thousands of spores inside the soil of the plant. So yeah, you got to be careful with plants, especially like plants and composting. Those are things that when you're trying to create a healthy environment, subject to popular belief with the plant, the photosynthesis, the oxygen, there could be just microbiological concerns there. So, you always got to look for those types of things and see how they're going to impact you. Rain, thank you so much once again. Really glad for you to be on here. This is an amazing show. I hope a lot of people have good things to learn from this episode. And, thank you again for being vulnerable and sharing your story today.
Thanks, Michael. It was such a pleasure. This is such a great podcast. I'm so glad myself and others who have personal experience are spreading the word.